Welcome to Pulpit to Pew, a podcast that features a conversation between priest and parishioner to understand how the message translates and to further explore the weekly lessons within the Episcopal tradition and daily life. The Very Reverend Beverly Gibson, Dean of Christ Church Cathedral, and Johnny Gwynn, a newcomer to the Episcopal family, discuss what Beverly intended and Johnny heard, or got wrong.
Hello, Beverly.
Hey, Johnny.
We're going to try something different today.
Okay, good.
What we're going to do is we're going to intersplice. Is that right? Is that a word? I think I made that up.
Sure. I mean, I get what it is, even if it's not a word.
So what we're going to do is we're going to take the sermon from church, and then we're going to kind of break it up. So we're going to talk about it from things that I wanted to ask questions about.
Good.
And then so we'll play a little bit of the sermon, and then a little bit of us talking, a little bit of the sermon, a little bit of us talking.
Right. Sort of like if you interrupted and asked a question.
Yes.
Right. During the sermon.
I've been listening to other podcasts, and I'm stealing somebody else's format for this, but I thought it'd be a nice change.
Well, stealing is where all ideas come from, right?
Right. Correct. And it's Guy Raz in the TED Talk Hour, which if you're going to steal, you steal from the best.
Steal from the very best. That's
yes.
right.
So in this sermon, we talk a lot about food.
Right.
Could food be considered religion in the South?
Absolutely. No question.
Why do you think
about
that?
Because we worship food.
Yeah.
I mean, we do. Think about the great shrine to and of pimento cheese, right, and the various styles of that. Sweet tea is a revered beverage, and if you don't drink sweet tea, something's wrong with you, right?
That's right. And then even the way you drink, like because it's even like the way you eat food and the way you drink something says something about you.
It does. It does. Fried chicken is, of course, another major totem, right? We can use that word. Then we could get into alcohol, right? And you could get into...
Well, we have wine at church.
We have wine at church, but if you think about the South and bourbon and distilleries and now the great fad, I shouldn't call it a fad. That sounds like it's a passing thing. But the fascination with that.
Right.
So we really are, I think, very proud of our culinary heritage, our food heritage, and it's a deep part of who we are. And I'm sure we'll talk about this in a minute. One of the things that John Edge, whom I mentioned in the sermon, is very interested in, as are others who are out there now writing about the culinary history of the South. They're very interested in where did our foods come from, what groups brought various foods and various traditions to the South. Okra, obviously, being one that came with African-American slaves who came to this country. The whole idea in our particular part of the South of gumbo, ways of putting foods together. If you think about very simple foods that have become a deep part of our tradition, red beans and rice, and rice itself and the cultivation of rice in the South. So all of these things are very much a part not only of our daily life and the way we live together and the way that we feed and nourish our families, but it's part of our economy. It's part of our sense of history and tradition and culture. So all of this is tightly woven into our sense of who we are in the South.
Here I go. But I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about some of my summer reading. One of the things that I've read this summer is a book by John T. Edge, and the title of it is The Potlikker Papers. The subtitle is A Food History of the Modern South. Now, John Edge is the director of the Southern Foodways Alliance, which is based at the University of Mississippi in their Center for the Study of Southern Culture. And it's a not-for-profit that documents and studies the diverse food cultures of the changing American South. Now, given that, it follows that his book really is not about foodiness as we know it now, but rather about real food and real people living in real places. And he begins this study with the women who cooked and fed and held together in body and soul the participants in the civil rights movement. And he talks also about the significance of lunch counters and cafeterias in that movement. And he moves on through time then to consider all sorts of different things in the South. The appearance of landed hippies in different areas in the South. The rise of regional fast food. The gentrification of Southern food and the renaissance in restaurants and farmers markets that we see happening all around us, and the resurgence and retooling of traditional ways of cooking. all the way up to the present moment with some community-engaged chefs like Raleigh's Ashley Christensen, whose restaurants have window signs reminding diners, don't forget kindness. Now, the title of the book, Potlikker Papers, is not a throwaway. Potlikker is a concept that is at the very heart of John Edge's study of the region and its people and its food. Now, if you don't know what potlikker is, well, bless your heart. But I'll tell you, just in case, because there will always be someone very young, very new. Potlikker is the nutrient-rich broth that is produced by the cooking of greens in a pot. And I remember the day that my grandmother taught me that word and showed me how to eat it by crumbling up cornbread in it, in a cup. That crumbling, as it turns out, is important.
What drew you to John Edge's The Potlikker Papers?
Say that 12 times
the
fast.
Potlikker Papers.
Potlikker Papers,
yeah.
Potlikker Papers. Like the Pickwick Papers, only different.
Right, and the Federalist Papers.
Yeah, all these things, yeah. Well, I actually subscribe to an email list called The Bitter Southerner. I don't know if you've ever looked at that before.
It's a blog, isn't it?
Blog, podcast, email list, all of these things that it is. And they come out quite often with not only reviews of books, but lists of books and things like that about the South. And obviously this book had been on it. And it just kind of caught my attention, and I got hold of a copy, and it was in my stack of things to read this summer. And so I read it while we were driving around and staying in hotels in various parts of the South this summer on our little vacation. And it was kind of cool because we would end up in a place and I would have read about somebody who was located in that place. And so that was a sort of an added
like a travel companion.
Yeah. So it was on my mind and had been present with me. And I am a Southerner. I love the South. And my own family heritage is dear to me, as it is to most of us. And so it just made sense when I got to this feeding of the 5,000. I thought, well, this is it. This is the welcome table. And that really is a spiritual that is very much part of our culture here in the South, our inherited culture that partakes of many other cultures. And it directly spoke to what John T. Edge is doing, and he puts that in the beginning of the book, and here it is in the gospel, and it ties in.
So in the book, they mention the 5 loaves and the 2 fish.
No, he does not.
Oh, okay.
He does not.
So I was thinking about that. It was like, you read secular things because, you have a life and, you do divinity things and you live a life. When you're reading things, do you put a mental note in your head of like, whoa, this would be good for the 5 loaves and 2 fishes sermon, or just was it serendipitous
Sometimes
this happened?
as my husband will tell you, and the people that I work with, I'm taking notes all the time. I take notes on every single thing that I read.
But how many times have you done the fishes and loaves sermon? You would need some new inspiration, I'm thinking.
It's like you've got to have something new every time.
Yeah.
Honestly, and I've had reason to think about this lately, I actually get better ideas and am more spurred to think theologically when I read things that are not directly addressed to Scripture or that are not quote-unquote churchy. I just do better with that. It makes more meaning for me.
But you talk about that a little bit as the hook. You always say, take something from today, and it's relevant because in your sermon, you say, hey, this is where this 5-minute conversation I'm having with you in church, this is where it connects with what we just learned in the reading.
Right.
It drew you in, so there's that check in your head of like, whoa, this would be a good way to draw other people in to say, hey, pay attention.
Right.
Yeah.
And in this particular case, it's doubly important because I think we are living right now in this region, going through whatever we're going through historically right now. And we're called as a Christian community to proclaim the gospel through what we do.
Right.
And if this is indeed how the gospel is proclaimed by each of us, then we need to own that, and we need to own it in our present moment and say, this is who we are, this is where we are, and so how is this a part of what we do and how we live?
the Southern food that John Edge is talking about, he looks at such a historical relevance to it. And it's not just food. I mean, this salvage food, this potlick, which is, something that's extra, who gets the green, who gets the crumbs,
the potlikker,
who gets, right. And it's kind of like a symbol for our past and our present with slave culture and Southern culture. And can you talk a little bit about how that resonates with you? I mean, it really does, and it goes how that goes forward in your sermon with that idea in mind.
Our whole sense of who's entitled and who's not is something that we don't examine, I think, most of us on a daily and individual basis. And we receive so much information now from television, news, radio, various other sources that we go to that I think encourage us not to think very well about those things, but to make some assumptions. And so when we bring it home, so to speak, when we bring it to the table and we begin to think about it particularly in terms of real people, and who are we, who's in our lives, when we gather, who is cooking, who's cleaning, who's sitting at the table, then that forces us to think in more particular ways. And it forces us to think in a gospel way that we might not tend to think well in on a daily basis. Does that make sense?
It does.
John Edge's work in this area of study started with a study of the Potlikker and corn pone debate of 1931, which was a real thing. You can go and look it up. That debate began when an editor at the Atlanta Constitution named Julian Harris ran an AP wire story about Huey P. Long, the governor of Louisiana. Huey Long had made a deal for road paving with a lead investor in a financial syndicate, and he attributed his success to having shared a supper of corn pone and potlikker with this person. Now, in an editor's note, Mr. Harris, who crumbled his cornbread, questioned Governor Long's habit of dunking his cornbread. And Long responded. And then Mr. Harris, because he couldn't resist it, sent a telegraph to the governor of New York then, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was in Warm Springs, Georgia, and asked him for an opinion, and then the debate began. Now, really what is interesting is what ensued after that, because people wrote letters to the newspaper. And in those letters, they used potlikker to talk about women's rights and class divisions and the failings and successes of emancipation and Reconstruction, and they talked about diet and nutrition, and they talked about Southern patriotism, and they talked about the economy. Remember, it was 1931. So potlikker, as the debate made clear, was nourishing a South that was wrecked with poverty at the time. And it served as a symbol for people to talk about their concerns and about their hopes and their dreams for the future. Now, potlikker is what is called, and every culture has one, a salvage food. And it is made up of something that is left over from something else. And for us in America, it goes back into the slaveholding past, when owners ate the greens and served the potlikker to the enslaved. And after slavery, it sustained the working poor and people who could not afford or who had no access to anything else, both black and white. And now, in the changing and gentrifying South, it takes on new meanings. And for us, it raises new questions. And those meanings and those questions, and that's why I'm talking about it today, are directly related to the gospel. And here, John Edge does throw away a phrase that I want to save and hold up today, and I hope we can hold it up in some conversation beyond today. When we consider food and feeding people, we are talking about who cooks, who cleans, and who gets to sit at the welcome table. Who cooks, who cleans, who gets to sit at the welcome table. Now, the welcome table is that great divine feast of Christ's coming again. Now, the welcome table is that great divine feast of Christ's coming again. It is captured in the words of that old spiritual, which is made up of lines sung in refrain. I'm going to eat at the welcome table. I'm going to eat and drink with my Jesus. I'm going to join with my sisters and brothers. And here all the world will find welcome. We're going to feed on milk and honey. And all God's children are going to sit together one of these days. Food, we call it table sharing when we talk about it theologically, is a way into history and community, and above all, it is at the very heart of Jesus' ministry. It is central to the practice of Jesus' way. And for those of us who would be his followers, who cooks and who cleans and who gets to sit at the welcome table are the foremost considerations of how we live. Who cooked? Jesus did. Who served? That was Jesus too. Who cleaned? That was the disciples, because Jesus told them to. And who got to sit at the welcome table? Everybody. The people knew that it was a sign. They understood that this was the same way that God had fed his people in the wilderness. And they understood that Jesus came from God to do that same thing for them. And it's a sign for us too. It's a sign of how we are to follow in Jesus' way, of welcome and of nourishment and of trusting in abundance.
On a daily basis. Does that make sense?
It does, because I've heard that story so many times, and it's a miracle story, and it's one of abundance, and Jesus got down to things, got things done, and there was many things that, he made available. Looking at it from the point of view of the service side, to say Jesus was the cook. Right. Even though he was the main act, he was the cook, and he was the cleaner, but he had a wait staff with the disciples. But the idea is everyone sat at that table, and the who cooks, who cleans, who is sitting at the table is something that really fits in the world we live in today. And like you said, it's a good view of where do I sit and what am I doing in this world.
And we do live with what we now call a service economy, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that's very much a part of the way we eat, of the way we feed ourselves. And so to begin to ask some questions about that, I think is worthy for us. If you think about the gospel story that we talked about on Sunday, which is from John, it's 5,000 people, and they've been following Jesus around, and they're coming up to the Passover, and so that meal is in the background. But here are all these people who, from a practical standpoint, have to eat. I mean, anytime we plan something in our lives, whether it's a wedding, a family gathering,
has a banquet.
It's like, what time is it going to be, and how are we going to feed people, and what kind of expectations will there be about what the meal will be like? So that's an enduring thing. I mean, that crosses cultures and crosses time. So all these people are following Jesus. There are 5,000 of them. They're out in the middle of nowhere. How are they going to eat? There's no place to send them. And Jesus asked the obvious question, what are we going to do to feed these people? And we're told in John's text that that's a trick question. He's testing. That's the word that's used. And so the disciples say, wow, we don't have the money to go buy bread for all these people. There's no way we could feed these people. And then another disciple says, hey, there's a boy here who has these 5 barley loaves and these 2 fish, but what is that? That's a drop in the bucket. That might not feed just the inner circle here. How about all these 5,000 people? And Jesus, of course, knows what he's going to do. And I love the way that John puts that. He said, tell those people to sit down, right? Everybody have a seat. And then he takes it, he gives thanks for it, and he distributes it, right? And it's in the grace of his distribution, right, that the abundance flows. And it's also important in this story that when everybody has had their fill, as much as they want, and that's emphasized, then Jesus says to the disciples, every one of you get a basket and go out there and pick up what's left over, right? Gather up the leftovers. And so they gather up 12 huge baskets overflowing with leftovers, right, from these 5 loaves and these 2 fish. So, and nothing will be lost. And of course, this is apocalyptic in its own way. It's presaging his own sacrifice, that everything will be redeemed, everything will be gathered up, everything will be brought in. And that's how the story resonates with the divine banquet and, with the ultimate coming of Christ again. And of course, at this point in his ministry, it's foreshadowing the Last Supper and his own sacrifice and all of those things. So it just is so earthy, and it's so real, it's so concrete, and yet it opens up so majestically in terms of God's abundance, God's love, God's saving embrace, and all of those things go, if you think about it, for us as human beings, right back directly to food.
Well, and you mentioned also that, and kind of hit me across the face when I heard it, was Jesus did a lot of dining.
He did
in the gospel. There's a lot of moments where it's him sitting either with the group or with a small group. And very important things are done over that table. He's not in front of 5,000 people, he's in front of 5.
Right. And you see him all the time going into someone's house or coming out of someone's house or saying, I'm going to come to your house today. And if you're doing that, you know that you're going in there to, at least you're going to get a cup of coffee, right? Or a glass of water or some tea, and probably something else too. You see him with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, right? Remember, at their house, and that's always a meal. And Mary and Martha are always cooking and cleaning and getting things ready. And that is not just a humanizing thing for Jesus. It is a divinizing thing. God makes those things sacred.
Now, if we consider the whole gospel story of Jesus' time on earth, we'll remember that he spent, and if you read back through the gospels looking for this, you'll be struck by it, he spent a great deal of time sharing meals with people. He is constantly going in and out of somebody's house to have a meal. Now, where he went and who he ate with was noted, and it was judged. And it was often scandalous because the people that Jesus ate with were sinners. They were tax collectors, and they were prostitutes, and they were people who lived on the margins. And he didn't observe all the right things. He wasn't concerned with purity and cleanliness, and he wasn't looking to be with the right people. He was looking to be with people where they really lived, and he was looking to bring his healing and hope to them there. His last directed action on earth, you remember, was to plan a meal and to give directions for it. And it was a meal that he shared with his followers to show them what they were to do after he departed from this earth, how they were to keep themselves ready and make preparation for his coming again. And that last meal is what we now call the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. It's the meal that we share with Jesus when we gather together at his table. And in it, we remember his life and his sacrifice, and we share in his body and his blood, and we look forward to the ultimate fulfilling of his kingdom, to the great heavenly banquet of all the living and now all the dead. And at that table, we're nourished and strengthened, and to use Paul's words from Ephesians today, we're rooted and grounded in love. Our shared life together is grounded there, at that table where we share that meal. And it is aimed there, at the coming of that meal for everyone. But what we're called to do along the way is the thing that meal nourishes us to do in the here and now. And the word that we use for that, we use it in the church, and now it's used out in our larger culture, is hospitality.
You mentioned the idea that we have kind of thrown hospitality around in modern day. Right. Tell me a little bit about how we think we've thrown that around.
Well, we've co-opted it. There is a hospitality industry.
Yep.
And I don't have anything against that. I think
they teach it in college. It's the hospitality industry.
You get a degree in that.
Yeah.
And it does have an aspect of how do you make people welcome? How do you make them comfortable? How do you meet their needs? How do you interact with people? That's all part of it. We've stayed at different times. In fact, we enjoy going to campus inns And many regional universities now have one. We stayed in one in Fayetteville, Arkansas, at the University of Arkansas. There's one at Auburn University. There's one at the University of Mississippi. And I love staying in those places because there's students in the hospitality program.
Right, learning.
Who they're working at the desk, they're serving in the restaurant, and they are so enthusiastic. And they're so on top of what it is they're doing and what it means. And that's just energizing and fun. So that's a great thing, but it's still an industry, right? So there's a piece in that that's about money and exchange and value, and that can sometimes obscure, what it is that we're really trying to do.
Yeah, like it's not genuine or something. Like, hey, here's the manual. Here's how you greet somebody at the door. Here's how you do this. But like you said, watching students, there's still a passion for it. And if it doesn't have a passion, it's obvious. But the people that are really into it, that heart is in it.
And there's still a real human connection.
Yeah.
And if you talk to people in the restaurant industry and the hospitality industry who really are getting behind something and really putting themselves into it and trying to push things forward. And John Edge writes about this in his book. You have somebody like Frank Stitt in Birmingham, Chris Hastings. There are folks here in Mobile who are doing the same kind of thing. They're really passionate about making connections with people.
Right.
And that's real and it's true, even though it's part of the economy, and I'm not trying to make the economy bad. I think what we're trying to do is to lift up the sacred side of this and to lift up the gospel side of it. When we talk about hospitality in the church, sometimes we run the risk of just making it another church word. We're going to have a time of hospitality, we
actually do have that.
We do, and I made a joke about that.
A welcoming committee.
Right. And sometimes that's better than others. Sometimes it's just some lemonade and a cookie. Sometimes it's a really impressive spread. And that kind of varies according to who's doing it and what the day is and all of that. But it should be, and this is the point, it should be an offering of the heart, right? It should be something done with love and with generosity and with thanks. And that is the model that Jesus gives. He feels compassion for these people. He loves them. He wants to.
Culture is hospitality. And we throw that word around pretty carelessly. It can mean anything. Sometimes it seems to just mean a little bit of lemonade and a cookie. But it's more than that. It is love. It is nourishing the soul. It is holding on to other people when they need to be held on to. It is cooking and it's cleaning and it's inviting people to the welcome table. That's all hospitality. And it's the ministry that we're called to share in Jesus' name.
That hierarchical chart of taking the story of the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Who's the cook? Who cleans? Who sits? And who's left out? Mm-hmm. Could we, at any one point, can we take that lesson to the idea of we can cook, we can clean, we can be invited, and we can be left out almost simultaneously? And the idea is, where do I fit in that with myself and those around me?
Right. Well, the Christian vocation is, of course, to model oneself on Christ, to be as Christ. And to be actually Christ in this world. And if he was the one who cooked, who saw to the cleaning, who made sure that everybody was at the table, then that's us.
Right.
That is us.
It's not about making miracles or doing. It's like you said. What is that hospitality? What is that cook? What is that cleaner in our lives?
And not to take that for granted.
Yeah.
And not to assume that it's something always that someone else should do.
Or beneath you.
Or that it's beneath you. Right. Or that someone else is just going to take care of that. Because it will be up to you to do. And, at one point in the South, maybe, there was a sense that generationally you would inherit those things. Your mother did them, and then at some point in time, you would pick that up. And I'm not sure that we're still there. But that is a grown-up place, isn't it? To realize that I am now the person who is to welcome people to my table or to this table, and to do the cooking and to do the cleaning, and to realize that is the way to be in the world. That is assuming my responsibility to the world, to others, to furthering a kind of civility and fellow feeling that needs to happen. That is work, and it's dignified work, and it's work that should be, for us, informed by love and not by resentment or simple duty, but that it is a loving obligation.
So consider this, if you will, in the week ahead in your own life, in your family, among your friends, at your work. Who is it that's cooking? Who cleans? Who gets to sit at the welcome table in your life? In our life here as the Christ Church Cathedral family, who cooks, who cleans, who comes to the welcome table? And in our community and in our world, how is that true too? Who's doing the cooking? Who's doing the cleaning? Who gets to sit at the welcome table? And who is left on the outside? Because those are real gospel questions. And they're the questions that the gospel this week calls us to think on. I'd like to close with the doxology, which is what it is from the 3rd chapter of Ephesians that we heard just a few moments ago, because it encapsulates so beautifully what this meal that we're about to share together strengthens us to do, and the mission that we're called in that doing to accomplish. Paul writes, I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Now to him who by the power at work within us is able to accomplish abundantly far more than we can ask or imagine, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations forever and ever. Amen.
So we need to start getting close to the end here.
Okay.
Let's go back. I want to go back before we leave. The Potlikker and corn pone debate of 1931 that you spoke of early on the sermon. I guess everything is political.
Yes.
And this just proves that even the way you dip cornbread into this potlick is something that defines you. Do you think Jesus would be a crumbler or would he be a dipper?
Oh, wow. Well, he would have to be a crumbler because, this is my body that is given, it's broken, right?
Oh, right.
Right. So
I know you'd have an answer for this.
Yeah, but I'm already biased because I'm a crumbler. So I'm going to side with that anyway. And the few times that I've come across cornbread that you could actually dunk, I didn't want to eat it.
Okay.
I'm just being honest here.
Yeah, one of the things I remember from my grandfather was he showed me how to put cornbread into milk.
Right.
And it was crumbled in there. Of course, he didn't dunk it like a donut. It was crumbled in, and you drank it, and then you spooned it.
Now, was this, as they said, clabber milk? Was this buttermilk? Or was this
I'm pretty sure this was just regular milk. We didn't live on the country. We lived in Lake Forest. It was, a regular middle-class home with a refrigerator, so I'm sure it was from the store.
Well, and this is part of my story. As they say down here in Mobile, I'm from up the country, right? And I was a little closer to some of that, and I can remember in my early childhood, there were still folks who brought eggs, and they brought milk, and they brought butter. And so we had that fresh, and it was, now of course that's chic, right?
Right, gourmet.
It's local, locally sourced, and all of that.
Farm to table.
Around us, it was a guy in his car or his truck who brought those things by. But it was really good. And so I do have that memory.
It had heart in it.
It did, and it had relationship in it, because you knew the person who made the butter, and you knew what the top of her mold looked like because it was on the top of your butter, and it was sacred in that way.
It was definitely important that that was the lifeblood of a family and then the community. So that's a great way to way of looking at that is hospitality, passion, care, heart overhead sometimes, with the idea of serving and also being invited and sitting at the table.
Right. And a gospel lesson for daily life and for community life in a church community and for our community life as a whole. It's the only way, I think, that we will heal the things that are broken.
Well, Beverly, thank you so much. This has been a different way of doing Pulpit to Pew. We will see what people think, and I just want to thank you for your time.
Thank you, Johnny.
And this has been Pulpit to Pew, and I'm Johnny Gwynn.
And I'm Beverly Gibson.
And Beverly, end on your final word.
Amen.
If you'd like to know more about Beverly Gibson and Christ Church Cathedral, please visit christchurchcathedralmobile.org. There you'll find information on the church, Reverend Beverly Gibson's recorded sermons and sermon notes.
If you want to know more about Johnny and his Sabbadoodles, visit pulpittopew.com.
I would also like to thank Deep Fried Studios and producer Stacey Wellborn. Without her, this show would not get made. If you have any comments, likes, dislikes, please send information to Stacey at deepfriedstudios.com. Everyone have a great day, and thanks for listening.